Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hey there.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so thankful to have you join us here today for our discussion of 1981's The Evil Dead.
Yay! This is exciting. I want you to know, listeners, that we're going to make our way through the official Evil Dead franchise. And so we'll, be every couple of episodes bringing the next installment to all the way up through the sadly canceled, much before its time, Ash vs. Evil Dead.
Yeah, at the time of us recording this, I have not seen that show yet. So I'm looking forward to, as we're working our way through all the Evil Dead, also me catching up on some of the Evil Dead things that I have missed.
And I think what we, Anthony and I, you and I have talked about this before, but one of the great things about this franchise is that, straight slasher film, not your cup of tea, that's okay. Go to a different film and you can have a campy experience. That not your cup of tea, go to a medieval history fantasy horror. That not your cup of tea, right? There's just so much. It's such a unique franchise to have this, a steady actor, a steady character, steady director, and yet each one is just its own beast.
It truly is, yeah. Each one really embraces that it's a singular experience and that you don't necessarily need to have any previous knowledge of the other things that have come before it or things that will come after it in order to have a great time with any one of the films within the Evil Dead trilogy or the remake. And I assume that's the same way with the TV show.
It is. I think you appreciate it a little bit more if you've seen the journey, but you really can treat it as a standalone text. And I'm going to make a bold claim that I'm not sure I'm prepared to fully support.
Love bold claims that you don't think about. Just say it. Just say it. Get out there.
You should always not think before you speak. But I would say that,
not like a true academic. That's not like you at all.
I know. Let's just throw critical thinking to the wind. But, I think about the Saw franchise, which I have a special place in my heart for the first one. I think the first one is actually remarkably well done, and I saw it in German in Germany at a time when my German was only so-so, and it's a perfect film because the majority of it's just someone yelling out 9, right?
I bet you felt like you knew quite a bit of German after seeing
I did
that.
Until the final monologue from Jigsaw where he's like, let me tell you what happened, and I was like, I have no idea what's happening. So independent of the film, I have a special place for the film in my heart, but I also just think it's fun. But when you get to Saw 27 or whatever one we're on now,
if there hasn't been a Saw 27 when you're listening to it, just come back and listen to this in 100 years, and there probably will be a Saw.
Or 5 years, right?
5 years. Yeah.
and the problem is that even if you've seen, even if you watch the Saw films back to back, which I tried to do once, but I saw, I think it was 6 or whatever number, had Donnie Wahlberg in it as the main lead. I didn't know what was happening. Right? I couldn't keep track of all the moving pieces and but wait, this was the real Jigsaw, but wait. And I think that's why a lot of times franchises, period, but especially horror franchises don't make it. Is that they expect you to have to understand their world so much in order to know what's happening next. And Evil Dead says, nope. We are going to be a franchise that you can enjoy in its gestalt form or individual pieces. It doesn't matter.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, because I think what a lot of horror franchises attempt to do is one-up themselves. I think that's kind of in any franchise, you're usually operating within a studio system. They want you to go bigger, bigger, bigger. And so horror franchises respond by getting crazier and creating more and more increasingly convoluted situations for them. Well, the Evil Dead franchise also goes bigger and does new things, but instead of just one-upping like the gore or one-upping like how many F-bombs the lead says or whatever, Evil Dead says, okay, well, what if we just completely reinvent what an Evil Dead movie is? And then it works because each thing is a new thing. Every film really does feel like it's adding something to the conversation, a new way to do this type of film that has never been seen before. Now, in some ways, that is just like with the first one, which we'll talk more about in just a second. It's just a really well-made Cabin in the Woods film that has incredible use of camera technique and prosthetics and stop-motion animation. The second one is incredibly campy, comedy film that just takes the same premise as the first, but just completely reinvents it. And then the third one is in medieval times, just completely a new wrinkle altogether.
And then the reboot, offers us that familiar framework, but from the awareness of coming, 30 years later, and having so many cabin films, including a film called Cabin in the Woods. And then, of course, the TV show just says, well, what happens when Ash is old and tired, and we're all tired of the same story? Well, let's bring a new layer. So, and I wouldn't say that in any respect is this exclusive to Evil Dead. I think Nightmare on Elm Street as a franchise.
I was also going to say Nightmare.
Excellent. Because, and again, you can do that, I think, easier when you approach your subject or your films with some levity, right? Nightmare is able to say, but what happened if there were a bunch of kids who all dreamed together, right? Like, they can go there because I think that they don't take that themselves seriously in a way that I think, for example, the Saw franchise does, right? The Saw franchise takes itself so seriously that every film becomes more serious, and it just kind of becomes weighed down in a way that I don't think the first film was, and in a way that I don't think some of these more clever franchises.
It's a real lack of self-awareness, because a lot of times, like with horror, we've talked about this before many times on this podcast, the line between horror, comedy, and then also we've thrown in like love and sex are all it's like a very thin line between them. And so when the Saw film doesn't recognize that there is some inherent silliness in a little puppet dude setting up torture games, it's weird that they don't acknowledge that. It's like, do they think they're doing a serious work here? Evil Dead doesn't do that.
No, Evil Dead, especially the first film, right? It's almost like, it's like they wanted so hard to create this like straight slasher film, but in the process they created something that they had to immediately acknowledge was a little goofy. And at the same time, one of the things that I like about this film is that it comes across as like it just so desperately wants to be like a B-rated horror, but it's really good, almost against its will, and it's really good because of the setup, the plot, because of the direction, the cinematography, that stop motion claymation, which just creeps me out. Like, there's so many reasons that this film works in ways that I truly believe they never anticipated the film working.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think anyone involved with this thought it was going to turn into this huge success. And I mean, it's hailed as being one of the finest examples of indie filmmaking. It's held in high regard as one of the best horror films of all time. Certainly one of the best cult films of all time. But Raimi himself, he was a college student when he was making this. He had just turned 20 right before the actual shooting of this film began.
I think you can tell in a couple of ways that we have a young director, literally and figuratively, both in terms of, there are some things that are not perfect about this film, both in terms of just like some of the decisions in terms of how scenes are portrayed, but also in terms of some of the scenes. So we can just talk about the fact that for a long time, I really didn't like this film at all and had a hard time making myself watch it because of the forest rape scene, right? But Anthony, you said that Raimi has since gone on to be saddened.
Yeah, I mean, again, this weird. He is a 20-year-old, which is not an excuse.
No.
Not. But he has since been asked point blank in interviews. He was asked this question directly: "Do you regret putting it in?" And Sam Raimi says he did. And he says that he just thinks it was too unnecessarily gratuitous and too brutal, and he just did not want to put it in. He says himself, quote, "I think my judgment was a little wrong at that time." So not a fan. And when they do, since Evil Dead 2 is kind of a remake of Evil Dead 1, Evil Dead 2, you see, even just when he made that one, there's no tree rape scene. There's the sequence with a tree, but it's not a rape.
And you're absolutely correct that to say that someone's 20 and therefore it's okay that they included that, right? That is not an acceptable statement. At no point, regardless of age, should you feel that way. I can also see, though, where, it would have been easy for them to have been, like, riffing about things to include and be like, oh, and you know what else we could do? And just not having a fully developed prefrontal cortex, thinking that was a good idea, or feeling like it was necessary because we needed the TNA, right, of a slasher film.
He talked about how he kind of got sucked in to wanting to go as gratuitous, and is like, wow, isn't that crazy that they put that in there on this shoestring budget, that they were able to get this in there? Wow, it's so edgy. And yeah, now he's like, that was too much.
And so, on the one hand, this is a film that is, the product of a young director. But on the other hand, and the reason that the second viewing, I moved it from being like a 4-star to 5-star rating in my sort of records, is because there's just so much that is right about this that I feel like Raimi himself may not have even fully understood in the moment how thoughtful he was being, how intriguing he was being with the narrative, particularly with the character of Ash, and in a minute I'll talk about that and bring in my article, but also just with some of the cinematography and the decisions that he made as the director.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that caught my attention, and then I promise we'll talk about Ash a little bit more, is, did you notice that there was a sort of it wasn't the full-on Ari Aster rotation of the world, but it was pretty darn close.
Yes, I did notice that shot. We commonly talk about, whenever we mention both of Ari Aster's films, that around the world shot, and I guess that means Ari Aster has watched himself some Sam Raimi films.
I mean, I would say that he had to have, right? Like that.
Oh yeah.
And so I would just like to gently say, while it might be great that Ari Aster puts it in his film, maybe I shouldn't be quite as impressed by that move, because it seems like the credit goes to Raimi for sure.
Admittedly, it is a good move, and it does always work, and it looks it's very effective when used. I mean, Ari Aster knows how to use it.
It's true.
So it does look good when he uses it, but yeah, it's not.
Although
his.
I am gonna wonder, like 10 films from now, right? Are we still gonna be like, my gosh, thank you for that? Like, I wonder if there's a shelf life for that particular move.
I guess we'll find out.
We will find out. So the article that I want to bring up today is from a edited collection of essays published by McFarland, and the book is called The Many Lives of the Evil Dead, Essays on the Cult Film Franchise. And it's full of just fantastic articles talking about the entire franchise, as the title implies. But the essay I want to particularly focus on, because I think it will be something that we'll come back to throughout our discussions of the Evil Dead films, is an article by Dale Bailey called Final Girl, Final Boy, Ash's Imperiled Masculinity. And in this article, Bailey talks about the fact that Carol Clover gave us this idea of the final girl, and we've talked about the final girl before. You know, it's the person who survives the slasher, but it's more than that. It's the person who is depicted as sort of a masculine coded as a little bit of a masculine character, so that the teenage and young men watching this character can root for her and root for her survival and sort of see themselves in her. And so that's why we have final girls that are oftentimes have more androgynous names and are coded visually as less feminine, and they undergo these trials and things like that. And so Clover argues that the final girl is this really intriguing construct that allows us to feel okay with this person surviving, because she's surviving in part because she's not highly sexualized, she's not doing the drinking, the drugs, and the sex, and then she's also, if we're going to go real Freudian, you know, often using a phallic-like weapon at the end to defeat the slasher, right? Mm-hmm. So Bailey says the Evil Dead franchise is not really overwhelmingly brand new in terms of, we had slasher films, we had films that were gory, we maybe not primarily in the United States, but we did, you know, we had this sort of like punk aesthetic, we had all these things happening, and so on the one hand, Evil Dead is not revolutionary, but on the other hand, when it comes to, in particular, its depiction of Ash and this depiction of what he calls the final boy, it does some really interesting things. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about Bailey's argument, because he makes some excellent points that I think are worth considering, and are honestly one of the reasons that I have a better opinion of this film upon sort of subsequent screenings. So he says that, you know, from the start, Ash is coded as being sort of effeminate or feminized. He's not even driving his own car right at the beginning, right? Like,
isn't he in the back?
Yeah, he's in the back seat with his sister and girlfriend, and like, you know, there's that line where Scott, is it Scott?
Yes.
And you know, Scott is like, did you get this vehicle checked out? And Ash is like, I did, you know. And so like, there's a whole layer in which he's not only not the alpha male, but he's literally with the women. And later we see Scott wandering around the cabin, and Ash is taking out the luggage with the ladies. And so we start there. And of course his name is Ashley, which always just kind of cracks me up, because that's my middle name. So I personally associate it with females. And so, you know, and his sister makes a huge point of calling him Ashley almost more often. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole bunch of other examples of, as the film progresses, of Ash being very feminized, right? One of the scenes that made me laugh this time around was when Shelley is like, you know, all deadite and like losing it, and Scott and Ash are just like standing there watching her, and like Ash has the axe in hand, and he's still like, I don't know what to do. Do I use it? Right? Like, I mean, this is a film that just makes him into this very feminized character, and so much of the film, Dale Bailey argues, so much of the film makes that seem to be a bad thing, right? Because, you know, he's with the ladies, and if only he had been stronger, he would have cut off Linda's head or buried her a lot sooner, right? Like, so there's so much of the film makes it seem that because he's not willing to, quote, take action, he's responsible for the second half of the film. But mm-hmm. what I like about Bailey's argument is that he says that at the end, though, it's because of Ash's more feminine, and that's in big quote marks, sort of traits, namely his use of this necklace that was part of, you know, this romantic gesture, to secure the book and to destroy it and all that stuff, that we ultimately see that he survives because he's not the traditionally masculine male figure. And so this is a film that complicates things by showing us that masculinity is complicated, and that this sort of feminized element can be both your the thing that destroys you and the thing that saves you simultaneously. And so I think that's just a really interesting way to read this film and to read this character, because a lot of discussions about the Evil Dead franchise are about something that is very important, and that is, at what point are we in the horror genre presenting toxic masculinity?
The subject matter we talked about before of like the effeminate man. We talked about this in our episode on The Babysitter, actually, and how in that film it's really painted as the little kid has to destroy his feminine side, or what is coded as like female-ish, childish, and weak. And how that's kind of problematic in presenting that manner, that you have to overcome. You as a man have to overcome that in order to be able to succeed. But Evil Dead does not ask that of you. It doesn't ask that of Ash.
No, it doesn't. And when you said that the genre often gives us these sort of like placeholders, right? We've talked about this too, that in genres like comedy and horror, it can be often difficult to really have developed characters when there's all these other things you're trying to put in there. And so it can be really easy to just say, we're going to have the strong male character, we're going to have the, quiet bookish girl. And weirdly enough, Evil Dead gives us all of those, right? We have, right. I mean, like, check mark, right? We have, the quote, more sexualized Shelley. We have the alpha boy Scott. We have the bookish Cheryl, and then we have the sort of like quiet, what should be our final girl, right? And Linda. Right. Because at the beginning, Linda's wearing a Michigan State sweater. She's fully clothed with like a turtleneck that goes all the way up. We expect her to be our sort of final girl. And then we instead, it ends up being Ash, who is this weird sort of amalgamation of all the things that we say are desirable and undesirable in a male character.
Right. And I wouldn't even say that the character of Ash is decidedly like effeminate either, in like all around, because he's not dressed particularly effeminately, or at least not in any way that would like is typically depicted of like an effeminate man. He is dressed fairly masculine, and Ash is dressed in a fairly masculine manner.
And Bruce Campbell, I mean, might have the biggest chin of like the most, he is a very rugged looking individual, which again we associate as a traditionally masculine appearance. And so you're right, he's not effeminized, but he's not effeminate, but he is feminized.
It's this weird juxtaposition between like what the outward appearance versus like the actions that the character takes.
Yes. And I think that, one of the reasons, in my opinion, honestly, that the franchise remains successful is because Ash is a surprisingly complex character. He's very romantically sweet. He gets his girlfriend this I thought it was hideous, but this is like lovely necklace. It's a thoughtful gift. He doesn't seem to be pressuring her, to make their relationship more physical. He's a pretty good brother. I mean, he's not perfect, but I'm not sure that Cheryl, is a perfect sister. She's kind of obnoxious most of the film, but he tries.
What sibling relationships are perfect?
I mean, certainly not that one. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in this rewatching is that how intellectual he is, right? Like, he's the one that keeps listening to the recording. He's the one that's like putting the pieces together. He's the one that kind of figures out, destroy the book, destroy the Deadites. And so I think that he's a very fascinating character that evolves just as much as the franchise does.
Mm-hmm. So we take this unique kind of like hodgepodge of different personality traits and stereotypes and like this weird character of Ash, and then what Sam Raimi brilliantly does is just puts him in this strange character who the audience is not super sure what they're going to do at any time, because they don't fit this like mold of any stereotype, and then you put them in this spectacle driven, insane, mad world.
And it's interesting that you use the word spectacle, because in terms of mise-en-scène, there's almost, it's like the antithesis of spectacle, right? Everything is grungy, and the cabin is tiny. Nobody who walks in it would be like, yes, I'm staying here. And yet you're so very correct that this is a film that I think needs that word spectacle attached to it. Is there anything in particular that catches your attention, or that comes to mind first when you think about the spectacle of Evil Dead?
Yeah, it's the stop motion animation, particularly the stop motion animation from the last third of the film, in which the film just really is like, all right, you thought we had given you some good stuff before, but now we're going to go absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, it's this film grosses me out in a way that, viscerally, in a way that a lot of modern films with all of their CGI just cannot do.
Yeah.
And
Something about like how it's truly not trying to replicate what like would actually happen. Like these are technically humans, and so yeah, I guess their inside should have real blood and realistic looking organs and whatnot, but it's whereas I think like a lot of the CGI, when anytime you try to do that, it falls into that uncanny valley.
Yes.
Where it's like it's just a little off. It's like a little too perfect in a way, and then it makes it a little off. Well, Evil Dead is like, no, it's not real. You're not gonna believe it's real, because it doesn't matter if you believe it's real. Are you gonna be grossed out though because the style we've chosen to do this in is so incredibly disturbing and specific? Yes. Yes, you are.
Yes, and I think you're right that what happens is exactly that a lot of films accidentally fall into the uncanny valley, and so then it's hard to find it as being what you need it to be. Whereas I think Evil Dead said, we're gonna live in that valley, and we're gonna like put down a farmstead and just like embrace this. And the result is that you feel uncomfortable the whole time because it's not right, but that's intentional. And I think, and it's not even just the stop motion, although certainly, like there's one moment when one of the characters is melting, and I'm pretty sure it's like cream corn that comes up, like that squirt out. I mean, it's just like, it's so gross, and I love cream corn, and it's just like so fundamentally not okay. But it's also things like how once they become deadites, like their hair color doesn't match anymore, because they're clearly wearing wigs, and they didn't even attempt to find wigs that would even come close to matching. And so there's just this sense the entire way through that everything is off, and that should make you feel uncomfortable because it's intentional.
And some of that obviously is due to the shoestring budget, which because Raimi himself stated that he would need $100,000 in order to make The Evil Dead as he envisioned it. Do you want to harbor a guess at how much money he was able to cobble together?
Oh, I'm so excited. I love guessing games. I'm going to say 5,000.
Okay, so that would be incredibly impressive if he was able to do it. But it is a little more than that. It was $90,000. And it's funny to read about like how he got that money. He basically just begged people to give him money, and he still was able to beg for and successfully acquired $90,000. So I guess that's pretty good begging.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure that's not the amount I would get if I started begging.
Yeah. But again, like you see like the discrepancy of like he wanted $100,000, he didn't quite get there, and so they had to cut corners. He couldn't do exactly what he wanted to do, and so they came up with a lot of like weird and new ways to do special effects, and those weird like things like the mishmashing wigs. Maybe if he had gotten all of the money that they wanted, they could have gotten real wigs, but they didn't, and so they worked with it, and it looks incredible.
And things like the famous, and deservedly so famous camera work,
just incredible cinematography all around from Tim Philo. Just
yes,
so good.
And I think this is a perfect instance of, with more money, they wouldn't have had to come up with this creative solution of how do we show that the evilness is lurking and watching without actually, having the evil, if they'd had more money, they might have tried to do special effects or had someone in costume or, anything like that, instead of giving us this POV shot where that we, talk about a low budget move. This is just a perfect example of how sometimes what a horror film needs is a smaller budget to be more creative about how to do things.
Like that, the camera work, all of the Dutch angles that Raimi would use throughout the filming. This shocked the crew, who was expecting to be able to just use the standard cameras that they had, their rigs, and just like line up a shot, shoot it straight. We'll get in and out of here. But they literally, because again, I just said they have a shoestring budget, they can't afford a camera dolly to get those really precise Dutch angle shots. And so instead, they just built incredibly elaborate low-budget rigs in order to get the Dutch angles that Raimi requested.
And some of the shots that are low angles, right? I'm thinking especially about when they're looking down into the cellar. Can't afford to have a tricked out cellar. That's fine. Let's not show the cellar. Let's show people looking down at the cellar. And I think, just a number of really inventive ways. And I would imagine that part of the reason that they couldn't afford these other things was that most of their budget was going to fake blood. Because just the sheer amount of fake blood in this film is just, like when the pipe bursts and it's just like in his mouth and face and everything. I mean, it's just astonishing.
You want to do another guessing game?
I love guessing games.
You want to guess? So I'm going to tell you. So the traditional blood formula is corn syrup and food coloring. Do you want to? Can you guess what extra ingredient was added to this traditional fake blood formula for this film?
I'm going to say that they went Hitchcock and put in Hershey's syrup.
That would be a great guess. It's actually on the other end of the spectrum. It's coffee. They added coffee.
And, as I was watching it, I was actually thinking about the fact that, especially compared to a lot of the films from the 70s, the blood in Evil Dead is so much darker.
Probably because it had coffee in it.
Because it had coffee. Because, in Dawn of the Dead, the 78 one, I mean, that blood is, like, as red can be. I mean, it's almost like on a spectrum where you're like, is that even still red or is that just pink? But yeah, coffee, that would make sense. Oh, look at me learning things.
Yeah, that's a new fun fact that everyone can use now.
And when you were talking about the camera work and sort of the inventiveness of it, you mentioned when we were talking earlier the final scene where the evil is charging at Ash, and how that scene was crafted.
Yeah, that it's become a bit of like an urban legend. Like part of the film itself is that in order to get that shot, they actually had Raimi get on a motorcycle with a camera in hand and ride after Bruce Campbell on the motorcycle with the camera while filming that scene.
And so the sort of like urban legendy part of it is that the expression on Bruce Campbell's face is perhaps the best, most authentic expression, because he's actually terrified that he's going to be plowed down by his friend. And whether or not that part is as true, I don't know.
Which it would make sense with the rest of the narrative of the film, because Raimi has come out and quoted that he loves torturing his actors. And one of the producers, Robert Tappert, said that Raimi enjoyed when an actor bled. So there are like, tons of injuries from the set. So if that had actually happened, it would make sense.
And I think that's also the advantage of a sort of indie type film, right? Is that you can have a connection between your actors and your crew that's going to be the lines are going to be blurred a little bit more, right? Like it's going to be, all of it's going to be a little less professional. If you read about like the production of this film, there's lots of things where they said, yep, that was an accident, but it worked out.
Yep.
And that's what happens when you have no budget to replace things if they get broken in a round of filming.
Yeah. And just because of how hectic the shoot was, Raimi just forgot to shoot some shots that would tie things together. So they had to try to get people back together again to do 4 days of frantic reshoots. Just because it's a low budget, you're doing this with your a lot of your friends. You're a 20-year-old. Yeah, of course it makes sense. You missed a couple of shots, I guess.
Exactly. Yes. It reminds me very much of Peter Jackson's 1987 film Bad Taste, in that it was another indie film where it was just like a group of friends filming, and they filmed it whenever they could get together. And so if you watch the film, sometimes an actor will have a beard, and sometimes he won't, and it has nothing to do with the passage of time. It just has to do with again, that sort of, there's something almost magical that can emerge out of an indie project because of the sort of frenetic energy that I think is associated with the budget and everything.
And it's just it's a different feeling than when watching a corporate made film, because with corporate films everything feels so tested and it cold almost, in a way that not the good cold where you're like, oh I don't know if I like how that makes me feel, but cold in the way of okay, a lot of people gathered around and made sure that this was going to appeal to the most amount of people.
And we've talked about the fact that films like 28 Days Later have multiple endings because of sort of what the audience preferred. We've talked about how with Hereditary by Astor that our biggest complaint about the film seems to be from the fact that there was a disagreement about what the studio thought the film should do versus what he wanted to do, so he kind of just threw in some witches to take care of things. And this isn't that, right? This is a film that had a very clear vision, and carries that vision through, again, I think through all of these different elements. And one of the things we haven't talked about, but I want to mention, is I think that Linda is one of the most disturbing components of this film. I think that when she just kind of pops up anywhere and everywhere, and she's just sitting there laughing. And again, to go back to that idea of the uncanny, more so than Cheryl. So Cheryl's makeup is just, over the top deadite. So is Shelley's. But Linda's is just a little shy of being actual beautiful makeup, right? Because she has what looks like blue eyeshadow. It's just above her eyelids. And so it's really interesting, again, how this film just embraces the fact that, you're going to feel uncomfortable because things are going to look exactly the opposite of, or just enough off of how you expect them to look.
Yeah. Yeah. And also her physical performance is really just excellent.
It is. And it's interesting because, at first the character is on the scale kind of the least important, right? And
least interesting.
I think that's really what I mean. Least interesting, right? Because Cheryl, has already had her panic attack. Ash is a rugged, handsome lead. Scott is, jovial. Shelley is Shelley is, the quote pretty one, whatever that means. And Linda just kind of is there. But then I think she becomes the most disturbing, and of course also the most humorous. One of the sources of humor, because we have Ash having his breakdown and saying things like, "Shut up, Linda," and so I think it's really interesting, again, to go back to the sort of sophisticated reading of the film. I think we could talk about Evil Dead for a while. Unfortunately, we will keep talking about the franchise for a while. But we are going to, between this film, discussing this film and discussing Evil Dead 2, we are going to have a sort of palate cleanser by talking about
1992's Candyman.
Yes, and so in many ways a sharp departure, but on the other hand, another film that's really gained a sort of cult following and that has done some really important things by taking a very familiar framework.
Yeah.
So we encourage you to listen to our, or to watch that film so that you're ready to listen to our discussion on Candyman. And in the meantime,
be sure to give us a like and write a review wherever you get your podcasts from. And remember to share us with your friends and follow us on social media.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.